Greetings, dear friends. I received a request from one of my listeners from Canada who contacted me through Facebook to give some update on Ukraine because some of you might be perhaps lost in the current media reports, or some of you may not really understand the real context of why and what is going on. So I'll try to be short because the history of East Europe is quite complicated and complex. It's not always easy to understand it, but it is not always easy to understand it because it's a completely different world from the one in which you, all people, grew up and operate. So, on the other hand, we are all witnesses that media globally has become one-sided, has been put into service of various agendas, programs, etc. And therefore, and this is of course is in particular true for the liberal Western media, which has become, as far as I'm concerned, completely outrageous. So, let me just give you some useful information you need to know and you need to keep in your mind. In the Second World War, one of the allies against Hitler, let's call it anti-Hitler coalition, one of the allies was also Russia, or actually not only Russia, but the former USSR, United Soviet Socialist Republics, headed by Stalin. Stalin was a dictator, a horrible dictator indeed, but we could not really equalize and make him on equal plane with Hitler. Hitler was a Nazi, Stalin was a communist. Stalin believed that the whole world should be changed, by revolution and become a communist and so-called progressive. Now Hitler was a dictator whose aim was to exterminate the Jews, exterminate the Slavic people, including the Russians, because, he regarded Slavic people a little bit above the animals as humans that needs to be eradicated and used for slave labor only and be destroyed by slave labor. Now, as you know, Hitler's policy was to destroy the Jews wherever they were and to destroy the Jews, as many Jews as possible, all over the world. So there is a huge difference between the two. You cannot really draw the line and put them on equal plane and say, they are both evil. Yes, they're both evil, but in a different way. So regardless, Russia was in anti-Hitler coalition along with the West, and other than Russia, in Eastern countries and all of those United Soviet Socialist Republics, there was one small country in East Europe, the only country that also was allied in both world wars, was allied with West. That small country was Serbia, whose capital is Belgrade. Now, after the war, of course, the spheres of influence, as we can call them, were divided. So basically, East Europe was under the Russian or the Soviet influence, and the West Europe remained under the Western, or we can call it British American influence. That part of history you will know by the fact that Germany used to be divided into the West and East Germany. East Germany was under the Stalin's predominance, and the West Germany was, of course, under the British and American predominance. Now, both Russia was part of a bigger country, so was Serbia. Serbia was in alliance with other South Slavic people, so there used to be a country called Yugoslavia, while Russia formed its union with other Soviet republics in the east, and Russia was basically the most dominant force in that United Soviet Socialist Republic state. What happened was, I'm mentioning all of this because it is all very relevant, because right now you'll hear in Putin's public addresses, you can hear that he calls on what NATO and Western countries had done back in 1999 to Yugoslavia, which was at that time formed by Serbia and Montenegro, And he has been accusing them of violating the international law, which is true. And therefore, that's why I just have this brief kind of description of Serbia and why is Serbia important. It is not directly important now in this conflict, but, indirectly you'll hear Putin always accusing the West of what is going on. Now my friend, my listener, and I'm thankful that he addressed me, he asked me if I could keep him up about Ukraine, because he said he could not believe the Canadian media. And my friend asked me to give a good update, and I thought it would be very useful to make this audio explanation, because I've been living basically most of my life I've been living in the East Europe. Some of my life I spent living in the West Europe, namely United Kingdom and the United States of America. So in a sense I have a grasp of both the worlds, and since I'm a native of East Europe, I certainly received the news that perhaps those of you living in the West do not. Besides, there is a history behind this conflict, and that history needs to be explained to you. Now, all the news, please understand, I receive in both Serbian and in Russian. In Russian, I can understand Russian to a great extent, and I received it in Serbian, so therefore some of those terminology, and especially when it comes to military, I'm not really much acquainted with that, how I might perfectly translate it into English language, so mind me not, I'm not a native English speaker, but I'll do my best just to portray to you the most important facts. So I've just explained to you what happened after the Second World War. So after the Second World War, Russia was part of the bigger Union. It was a state also composed of Russia and other Eastern Soviet republics. And what happened was that Russia was certainly under the dictatorial communist regime by Stalin. And after Stalin, that regime kind of relaxed a little bit. It was different, but nevertheless, USSR, United Soviet Socialist Republics, remained a big competitor to the West. And there was always this competition between United States and United Soviet Socialist Republics. They were racing, who is going to get better armed, who is going to be armed more, who is going to be stronger militarily, who is going to first reach the moon, and stuff like that. It was the era, after the Second World War, it was the era called the Cold War. You've certainly, probably most of you have heard of that. And there was a Cold War curtain, basically nothing from the West could reach anything in the East. There was this kind of control imposed on East Europe, on Czechs and Slovaks and Polish and Hungarians, have I missed somebody, and Romanians and Bulgarians. Serbia was one, for some time after the war, for several years, was under the Russian dominance. It was part of this Eastern Bloc, or Warsaw Bloc, but there was a conflict between the leadership of Serbia, or at that time Yugoslavia, and the leadership of Russia and the USSR headed by Stalin. So somewhere around the end of the 40s, toward the end of the 40s, this big conflict caused a total division. And then former Yugoslavia, of which Serbia was part, basically turned to West. And therefore Yugoslavia as a country was never really behind the Iron Curtain, as it was called at that time. It was a fairly open country when the tourists from all over the world could come, and the cultural influence was allowed to be coming from the Western sphere. So Yugoslavia was never really part of Eastern Bloc. Yugoslavia declared its own way, its own socialist development, and just went its own way, but it was, that way meant cooperation with the West as well, because, one part of Yugoslavia was a great ally to the West in both world wars. That part of Yugoslavia was not Croatia, it was not Slovenia, it was not Macedonia, it was not Kosovo Albanians. That part of Yugoslavia who was ally with the West in both world wars was Serbia and Montenegro. Now, what happened within USSR was that the communists, led by their own interests or their own goals that many of us could not really understand, decided to obviously maim Russian mainland, I guess in drive to kind of suppress or prevent Russian dominance within the USSR. Now this meant that certain parts of territories that had always been Russian, and I underline had always been Russian, were actually separated from Russia and given to another Soviet republic, which was called Ukraine. Nobody really understands, and Vladimir Putin referred to that in his speech in Russian, which he gave just before he entered the Russian-dominated two areas, Lugansk and Donetsk. Vladimir Putin referred to history. I listened to that speech, of course, in Russian, in which he explained that for an unbelievably and unknown reason, the communist regime had given 3 territories over to Ukraine for no obvious reason. One territory that was given to Ukraine that had always been Russian territory was Crimea. And the other 2 areas are the other areas currently which are cause of the current conflict, were the Donetsk and Lugansk Republic. Now you have to understand, dear friends, that in those areas, the most dominant, the predominant, however you want to put it, population was Russian, ethnic Russians. They spoke Russian, they were ethnic Russians, they used to belong to Russia, and all of a sudden, by the decision of the communist authorities within USSR, they became part of Ukraine. For whatever reason. Now what happened was, as you probably know, USSR disintegrated eventually. Towards the end of the 80s, USSR disintegrated and fell apart, and all those Soviet republics became independent states, and they were recognized as independent states within the borders that they had at the time of their disintegration. Very similar thing happened to former Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia also disintegrated, and there was a rump Yugoslavia, you might say, now made up of Serbia and Montenegro. Its official name was the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, now composed of 2 federal units, Serbia and Montenegro, while as in the past it was composed of 6 federal units. Something similar happened something similar that happened within the Yugoslavia was that the communist regime decided to maim the Serbia under the pretext to prevent or stop Serbian predominance and so-called Serbian unitarianism. So Serbia was basically divided into 2 more parts, 2 autonomous provinces, one in the north, Vojvodina, and the other one in the south called Kosovo. Now Kosovo means the blackbird field. It amazes me that the ethnic Albanians, who of course became majority over the time, still retained the Serbian name for their so-called state. Kosovo is not an Albanian word. Kosovo, kos in Serbian is a blackbird, and Kosovo field means the blackbird field. That's another story. So this is what happened to both of those countries. So Russia was basically a victim of the communist regime. It was maimed. It was recognized internationally within the borders, but without certain parts of their Russian ethnic population that remained in other countries, not only in Ukraine, but there were, certain segments of Russian population that also remained in the Baltics and in other Soviet republics, and therefore Russia became kind of a maimed country, but still remained relatively peaceful and recognized internationally, recognized all those Soviet republics as independent states. And then what happened with Ukraine was that over the time, Ukraine somehow did not make any significant progress toward economic prosperity, unlike all these other Soviet republics. All these other Soviet republics at least made some progress, but Ukraine remained kind of beset by corruption, beset by economic tragedy, and that's all due to various corruptive regimes. Now, at one point, there were elections that were obviously rigged, and the Ukrainian society just went more and more to the right, and there was a huge anti-Russian sentiment in the Ukrainian society. Even a revival of neo-Nazism was noted in the Ukrainian society. And when I say neo-Nazism, you have to realize that Russians, during the Nazi occupation of Europe and the Nazi onslaught on Russia, led by Hitler, Russians lost 25 to 27 million people resisting the Nazi regime. Now, the neo-Nazism in Ukraine, as its goal, had to basically, kill all the Russians, ethnically cleanse them, and make an ethnically cleansed Ukraine. And the new regime, sadly, in Ukraine, wanted to join NATO, and, was quite anti-Russian. Now, you need to understand also when the Soviet Union disintegrated, the promise of the West to Russia was that they would never expand to the east, close to the Russian borders. That was the promise of the West, which the West never really kept. I mean, just look, where are those Baltic republics? Are they in NATO? And so on and so forth. So the promise of the West was never kept, and the West continually was looking for ways to kind of beleaguer Russia and expand to the east. Russia had been constantly warning the West not to do that, constantly reminding them that that is not according to the agreements made after the disintegration of USSR, but the West did not care. The West did not care. The West just continued with its policies. The West also decided at one point to bomb the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, that is Serbia and Montenegro, under the pretext that they have to protect the local Kosovo Albanian population, supposedly against the Serbian genocide. Well, what they failed to tell you was that the Albanians, by the time, Albanians have pushed out many Serbs out of Kosovo because they were their birth rate was unimaginable, unbelievable. They would have like 10 children or even more. And over the time, they became the majority population of the Kosovo province, which was the Serbian province, traditionally always the Serbian province. They became majority. They were not always treated right by the Serbian authorities. Yes, I certainly agree with that. But it was far from being a genocide. And Kosovo Albanians, over the time, formed the Kosovo Liberation Army, KLA, which was even listed, I think, even by the State Department as a terrorist organization. And that's what it was. KLA, which committed numerous crimes against the Albanians loyal to Serbia and against the Serbian population. So the West, led by the United States and its President Bill Clinton, decided to bomb Kosovo and to actually make it separate and make Kosovo an independent state. Very similar NATO and West was doing with Ukraine. Very similar. Even though the pledge was to Russia never that the NATO would never expand to the West, to the East that is, they were constantly actually wooing with the Ukrainian regime and attracting Ukraine to the West and to the NATO, promising them the membership in both European Union and NATO as well. Now, interesting with Kosovo is very rich with some minerals and certain elements and it has certain mines of certain minerals and things that are very rare in the world. So that should explain to you and to me why the West wanted Kosovo, not really to protect the Albanians, but really to reach and grab those wonderful rare minerals from Serbia. And Serbia being an ally in both world wars, was also very close to Russia. That's understandable. So they created this monster state, independent so-called Kosovo Republic. I say monster state because the Albanian mafia now, as far as I read in the reports, has now exceeded even the Cosa Nostra in America. The Albanian mafia is very mighty now. It operates all over the world. So the West, sadly, has allowed that to be happening. So if you have any problems in your countries, in your towns with Albanian mafia, well, don't blame Serbia, blame Bill Clinton, because he was illegally, contrary to the international law, bombing 78 days, was bombing Serbia. About 3,000 people were killed. All of the Serbian infrastructure was destroyed. And what is even worse, tons of depleted uranium illegally dropped on Serbia. That's the legacy of Bill Clinton. Why was it illegal? Because any such intervention against a sovereign country, and at that time the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, made up of Serbia and Montenegro, was a recognized independent sovereign country, any such intervention requires the sanction by the United Nations Security Council, and there was never such a sanction, there was never such a decision by the United Nations Security Council to bomb, at that time, that rump Yugoslavia. Not only that, but Bill Clinton also violated the Constitution of the United States, because such an attack on a sovereign country needs to be sanctioned by the U.S. Congress. Never ever did he have endorsement by the U.S. Congress to do something like that. So the whole operation against Serbia was completely illegal and was in contravention of the international law. So we can say that is in brief exactly a short presentation of general history of Russia and of Serbia. Now, let's come now to the present time. When it comes to the present time, Ukraine, sadly, Ukrainian regime was not only corrupted, but sadly, there has been, as I said, a revival of neo-Nazi ideology. And the neo-Nazi ideology of Ukraine implies hatred and extermination of the Russian nation. And so, those parts now of modern-day Ukraine, populated by the ethnic Russians, were very much upset, including Crimea. Again, if you look back into the history, my friends, never ever before the USSR had Crimea been Ukrainian territory. It was always part of Russia. And therefore the Crimean people organized referendum, a democratic referendum, and over 90% of people of Crimea decided to, well, you would say join Russia. I would rather say return to Russia, because they were separated from Russia by force and without any democratic means by a dictatorial communist regime of the Soviet Union. So the Crimean people returned to Russia. Of course, Ukraine was not happy with that, because Ukraine was indeed recognized within those borders, including Crimea, but however, again, those borders were drawn by the dictatorial communist regime, and those borders are not, in a sense, realistic. Then, in their hatred against the Russians, and being, of course, encouraged by NATO and USA and EU, who are increasingly anti-Russian for no reason whatsoever. So being encouraged by the NATO and being promised to have a prospective membership of NATO and to become a part of EU, the Ukrainian regime now wanted to basically create a unitarian Ukraine and had been violating the human rights of the ethnic Russians in those two republics, Lugansk and Donetsk. Donetsk and Lugansk, they are the two areas, the two provinces, you might say, basically populated by ethnic Russians, and they were, again, to remind you, were given to Ukraine by the dictatorial communist regime for no reason whatsoever, other than perhaps to expand the Ukrainian Soviet Republic at that time for whatever reason. However, those two areas that were given to Ukraine without the consent of the local population have always been populated by the ethnic Russians, and the Ukrainian regime was violating their human rights. The Ukrainian regime then decided this year, well, there were some skirmishes, and as you know, the war back in 2014 and 15, and in those skirmishes and in those conflicts between the Ukrainian forces and the local Donetsk and the Lugansk forces, about 13,000 people were killed. In the Donetsk region, about 4,000 people were murdered in those conflicts. And the conflicts were, again, the Ukrainian forces were trying to drive the Russian population out and commit an ethnic cleansing of those territories. That didn't work, and then came the famous Minsk agreement, which, according to the Russian side, was violated by Kiev, by Ukraine, numerous times, with a tacit approval of NATO and the European Union. NATO and European Union never reacted to such violations, and Russia was constantly being accused of, imperialism, trying to do this, that, and the other, of violating human rights, etc., etc. As I mentioned, about 4,000 people of Donetsk area died, which is not a small number, and there was constant plan by the Ukrainian government to take those two areas by force and force the Russians out, the ethnic Russians out. Very recently, the military intelligence by one of those two regions, I think it was Donetsk, we have Donetsk and Lugansk. So the Donetsk region, populated by the ethnic Russians, its military intelligence came into possession of the plan drawn by the Ukrainian government to attack those two areas populated by ethnic Russians and to drive them out. And of course to drive them out and to basically install the centralist Kiev, centralist Ukrainian government in those areas. But to do that, to install your own government and your own people, first you had to drive out people who are ethnic Russians, who do not want to have the centralist Kiev junta ruling over them, and with the help of even neo-Nazis. Sadly, the Ukrainian regime has been wooing, as I mentioned, with the neo-Nazis. There's been revival of the neo-Nazi ideology. Bandera was their local Nazi leader. The Bandera movement has been revived, and that's what always was scaring Russian people, because they know what Nazism means. And so when the Ukrainian government plan to attack those two areas, Lugansk and Donetsk, populated by the Russians, was discovered, the concern by the local population in those two areas, as well as the authorities in those two areas, was alarmed. They had to alarm the Russian Federation. They alarmed, of course, the Russian government, and the Russian government said, well, enough is enough. In the meantime, NATO was telling Ukraine, well, we'll have you as our membership, we support you, your sovereignty, your territorial integrity, all that stuff. We will be by your side. But of course that didn't scare Russians at all. So, the plan by the Ukrainian government was discovered, and in the meantime, Ukrainian government amassed military forces on the border of those two areas populated by the ethnic Russians. So the Russian side knew that all along, and the Russian side and Russia decided to finally move in and prevent the possible ethnic cleansing and the genocide that might have been committed against the ethnic Russians in those two areas, which territorially and technically belong to Ukraine, but have never been really Ukrainian territories. So Russia moved in first to repel those Ukrainian forces that were amassed on the borders, at the borders of those two regions, Donetsk and Lugansk. So they first kind of repelled them in those areas. And then Russia realized, well, the whole Ukrainian military system has been now, in a sense, integrated into the NATO commanding force, into the NATO power, and that's exactly what Russians never wanted. By the way, Russia was promised that NATO would never expand to the east. And so, the Russians, yes, they moved in. Once they moved into those two regions, then they continued to move in and to neutralize all of these other Ukrainian military powers, military air bases, Ukrainian Navy, etc., etc. So this is what happened today, as you noticed. During the day, this was Friday, on Friday, 25th of February. What happened first, there were skirmishes on the outskirts of the capital, Ukrainian capital, Kiev. And then Kiev fell into the Russian hands. The Russian president has even appealed to the Ukrainian military, please stop military operations, let's negotiate, because we think we could count on you. We could barely count on the Ukrainian government, which has shown pro-Nazi proclivities, which has shown in action that they are anti-Russian, so, you know. And also the Russian government, the Russian president, and the chief of staff have also asked the Ukrainian soldiers to put down their weapons. Whoever puts down their weapons and surrenders will be treated humanely and will be let to go home and join their families. That is, brethren, what is currently going on. Now, as far as I'm concerned, you might say that I'm partial. I might be, but you know, it's my assessment is I'm very sad about the civilian casualties. I survived the bombing of Serbia back in 1999 by NATO. I've survived the destruction of my nation, and I'm very much, my heart grieves for those civilians in Ukraine and also those Russian civilians that were murdered in the two regions populated by ethnic Russians. If I were the Ukrainian president, instead of declaring a global mobilization or a global draft, whatever you want to call it, I don't know how would you call it in English, a total draft, I would have capitulated to spare civilians from suffering. Because Russia is certainly much stronger than Ukraine. That's obvious. That is completely obvious. Russia, again, is stronger than Ukraine. And no, there is no way that Ukraine in the long run is going to win the war. No, certainly not. Certainly not even without the Western support. In today's address to the Serbian nation, the Ukrainian ambassador said that several Russian tanks were destroyed and they could not have been destroyed without the British help. So the help that they received from the British helped them really destroy several of those tanks. But anyway, Ukraine, even with this limited Western support, is not strong enough to resist and win over Russia. That's as clear as the day, as the sunny day. So, if I were a president, I would have capitulated anyway. I would have spared the country from further civilian casualties and suffering. I would have negotiated some kind of position for my country to remain neutral. And that's what Russia always wanted. Russia always wanted the Ukraine to remain neutral, not to be part of NATO. However, the Ukrainian government now, the Ukrainian president kind of offers and asks for negotiations. Russia has accepted it, but Russia has given a good assessment. Russia said, until yesterday, Ukrainian president wanted to be part of NATO, wanted to be part of the European Union, and now all of a sudden he wants to negotiate for his country to be neutral. How can we really trust in that kind of ideology? And how can we trust such a person? Regardless, Russia said, nevertheless we accept the we accept the peace agreement, but we accept the dialogue. We accept to establish the dialogue. Now, Russia suggested that the dialogue should be held in Belarus because the Belarus president offered to kind of mediate in that conflict. However, Ukraine demands that such dialogue be held in Warsaw, the capital of Poland. That has been the latest news that we know about. But anyway, I just wanted to give you the background of why Russia has intervened. Russia has intervened and has been mostly completely targeting the military bases, military barracks, military command centers in order to neutralize the Ukrainian army. Because the Ukrainian army, being led by a pro-Nazi regime, can only commit one thing: ethnic cleansing of all the Russians that live in Ukraine, not by their own choice, but because it was the communist regime that made them live in in today's Ukraine. So that has been the latest. No wonder that the current situation is going to change the world order, indeed. But one thing is for certain: for decades, the Church of God preached to the world that there would never be a conflict and direct war between Russia and America. And I certainly believe that. Such a major event certainly would not be something that God Eternal would not give us as a warning in His Word. So therefore, as you can see, regardless of arrogant, boastful American stance, we will just, show Russia how mighty we are. As you can see, America even did not enter into the direct conflict with Russia. Neither did Germany, by the way. Germany even refused to send any military or other help, to send any arms to Ukraine. So therefore, we can see that the prophecy of the Bible will be fulfilled. There will be no war between Russia and America. That's for sure. What will happen to Ukraine and with Ukraine we're going to see in the forthcoming months? Well, in several months we're also going to see a victory parade in Moscow. And the new weaponry, or what we thought would be the only new weaponry of Russia, will be displayed. But we always know that Russia never tells the whole story. Russia is far more stronger than what it presents to the world. I think that the world knows that, and that's why neither NATO nor United States dared enter into conflict with Russia. So there is nothing to worry about. Of course, what will be the economic consequences we're going to see in the forthcoming months. But no, there will be no war between America and Russia. America, of course, has implemented sanctions against Russia, so has the European Union, but I don't think that is going to hurt Russia that much. You need to understand, dear friends, that according to the prophecy, Russia is the head of the Euro-Asian Union. And it was announced by Moscow today that Russia is going now to turn to Asia. So, Asia is a huge market. Asia is traditionally Russian ally. There has never been closer ties between Russia and China. They are now the closest strategic allies. And therefore, Russia will turn to Asia. Russia will certainly find ways to mitigate, what's the better word? Well, to neutralize those sanctions imposed by EU and America. So I'm not really worried about Russia. Russia will find its way out. You have to understand, if Joseph Biden is that stupid to do these things and provoke Russians, the rest of the people, need to know one thing. Russians are unbelievable people. They're just crazy enough. Russia survived terrible Nazi onslaught. Russia survived horrible winters. Russia survived all kinds of things in its long history. It's a very durable and tough nation. And so Russia will survive even whatever sanctions would be imposed against it. And one more thing that perhaps your Western media may not have reported on. Putin, it was on Thursday, Russian President Putin said that for those who might be tempted to meddle into the Russian operation against Ukraine, those who might dare or be tempted to be meddled, that they should know that the Russian reaction would be immediate, with consequences never seen in history that those nations have never seen in their history. And I do believe him. Russia is very resolute now. Russia has had enough. For 8 years, Russia was trying to kind of broker that peace. For 8 years, Russia was taking the violation of the Minsk agreement. For 8 years, Russia was witness of violation of that. Was enduring. The Ukrainians was enduring their plans. That was always plans. Was not there to ethnically cleanse all the Russians from Ukraine. So Russia has taken it, and Russia has had enough. The Russian bear is now awake. You know, when it sleeps, it's wonderful, but when it's awake, you better watch out. And if one thing, every time the European Union and America comes and says, but this is the violation of international law, Russia says, yes, but what was your NATO action against Serbia back in 1999 when you bombed the whole country and destroyed its infrastructure? That was also a violation of the international law, but you didn't seem to care. And you just didn't you didn't care at all that it was the international law violation. So now, what do you want now? You have been violating international law since 1999 when it comes to Serbia. And now, when Russia intervenes to protect the ethnic Russians, in Ukraine you say, well, it's violation of international law. Well, it's true. One cannot say it's lies. So, brethren, many of you, however, have no clue. Many of you have forgotten what happened in 1999. Many of you have no clue about the history, not even the history about the Second World War, let alone about history even further into the past. But many of you have no clue about all those things because you're not educated in your schools about it, and your media does not educate you for anything. Your media just is in service of the liberal and perverted politicians, like the Canadian government is, like the Canadian Prime Minister is, like that sleepy, creepy Joseph Biden is, etc., etc. Anyway, don't worry about the end of the world. This is not the end of the world. This might be the end of the world order as we know it. And it certainly shows you once again that no, America is no longer the dominant power that everybody should be shaking their boots about. The American president is not yet, has not been yet informed that the American president seems to be living in his own world, totally demented and totally detached from reality. This is not the end of the world. No, there will be no war between Russia and America, but for sure, America will not dare attack Russia at all. We know that as Christians, so this is not yet the end of the world. What we know as Christians is, according to the Bible prophecy, that it will be the supposed American ally, Germany, that will bring the end to America and to British Isles as we know it. And later, when Germany would go to attack Russia, according to the prophecy, Russia is going to attack back and is going to retaliate to the point that it will just make a whole mess, that is the whole desolation of the various European countries that are just, becoming neo-Nazi. That is what has been going on. Basically, you wanted some update on Ukraine. This is what was going on. You might ask me, what do I expect? Well, I expect that some kind of peace might be brokered, hopefully, so that the civilian suffering would stop and the peace would just bring Ukraine to become a neutral country, or perhaps merging of the countries is not excluded. Ukraine might become, again, in union with Russia, some kind of federation or confederation, who knows. Belarus will probably join them as well, so you'll have a huge Slavic union all of a sudden against the West and against NATO. The one thing is for sure, this is what Serbia could not do, even though little Serbia was resisting NATO attacks, NATO bombing back in 1999. Big Russia can do it now. Russia has been flexing its muscles before the world. With the message, don't play with us, because if you do, the consequences will be dire. Now, NATO is obviously now becoming inactive or inactive. NATO wants to be active, supposedly a defense alliance, but NATO has actually shown that its political instrument that is used by various governments to meddle into other countries' businesses. So this alliance now, after this debacle with Russia, will be most likely disintegrated eventually, and is dominated by America. At the same time, we have another force on the horizon, looming on the horizon, being constituted right now. That force is called the European Army. The European Army led by Germany. We're going to see it with our own eyes. So NATO is going down, and it eventually will be demised, and with it, the American dominance in Europe, and European Army dominated by Germany is going to rise and be, like I said, dominated by Germany. And one more thing that I have to say, that I think is very relevant. I've been very sad that various countries have not taken a neutral stand, which they should. For example, we don't notice any reactions from the Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries. We know that Sweden is a neutral country, and that's very commendable. But the Nordic countries have not said anything against Russia or against Ukraine. That's okay. Serbia has taken a very neutral stand. Serbia said, we are certainly close friends to Russia, but we are not going to recognize those two republics because we do respect the international law. Those two regions recognized by Russia, even though populated by ethnic Russians, are, yes, technically in the Ukrainian country, within the borders that have been recognized by the international law. At the same time, Ukraine has not recognized the self-proclaimed Kosovo, created by NATO bombing, and with the blessings of American administration. So therefore, we certainly cannot say anything bad against the Ukrainians, so we'll keep quiet. We want to have peaceful resolution, Serbian government says, but we are not going to be siding with any side. We'll just stay neutral. And I think the best for all the world would be better to be neutral. Because the Western countries, that is the Western governments, have been violating international laws for years and years now, here in East Europe, and I'm in Serbia, creating a self-proclaimed Albanian state of Kosovo, trying to turn first Kazakhstan against Russia, now Ukraine against Russia, and even the Syria against Russia. And all of you who remember what your government did, you always keep saying Iraq, we were lied about Iraq. There was no any weapon in Iraq, no chemical weapons. Well, that's right. Your governments have been lying to you for years. Not only about Iraq, about Serbia, about Syria, about any spot in the world. Wake up! Your government lies to you, and so many gullible people believe. Satan deceives the whole world, Revelation 12:9. Your media is in the hands of Satan. Your government, your Western governments are in the hands of Satan, indeed. So wake up and understand. Your governments and your government media is lying to you about not only about Iraq, they only lied about Libya, they lied about Serbia, and everywhere that there was an intervention, we have chaos. From an orderly country, Libya has become what? A terrible place. Serbian infrastructure was completely devastated, all the factories destroyed, railways destroyed, roads destroyed, bridges destroyed. And tons of uranium, depleted uranium, was dropped on Serbia, so that the Serbian population would be dying for decades from cancer, leukemia, and other uranium-related diseases. Horrible as it is. Yes, I'm telling you the facts. Russia has had enough of this. Russia knows all of this. Russian government is well acquainted with all the crimes of the Western governments. Russia has had enough. So, the Russian bear has been awakened. And woe be to anyone who plays with Russia. Because Russia used to be an insignificant country back in Boris Yeltsin's time. But in the meantime, Russia has become a world superpower, whether people believe it or not. For years I've been warning my people and others that Russia will be a superpower, that Russia is not a country to play with. Plus, Western media is so anti-Russian. It's saturated with Russian sentiments. Why? I don't know why. Russia doesn't care about you. Do you hear me, Americans and British and Australians and New Zealanders and Canadians and others? Russia doesn't care about you. Russian interest and sphere of influence is Asia, Asian basin, not you. Russia doesn't give a damn about you and your countries and your democracies or lack of democracies. And Russia is not the one who is planning to destroy you. No. The one who is planning to destroy you, the one who hates you, is your supposed ally, Germany, which is quietly and secretly building its own various weapons and infrastructure that will eventually cause the end of your countries. That is what has been prophesied in the Bible. Not Russia, but Germany. One thing that I wanted to say is I'm terribly disappointed with the reaction of Israel, the state of Israel, that supports Ukraine and has turned completely anti-Russian. Well, I'm very sad. You know, there are many Jews who live in Russia, peaceably and peacefully. And I think Putin's, whether his mother was Jewish, somebody in his family was Jewish anyway. Putin has not been reviving neo-Nazi ideology. It was sadly Ukraine. I know there are many Jews living in Ukraine. There are many Jews who lived in Ukraine. But I just want to tell to the Jewish world, I just want to say one thing. I'm partly Jewish myself. As far as I remember, the Second World War, my dear Jewish compatriots, the Nazi death camps and Nazi concentration camps like Sobibor and others, the guards in those camps were not Russians, but Ukrainians. I'll just also remind you of Crimea. If Crimea was Ukrainian, back in that time, if it was not populated by the Russians at the time of the Second World War, Ukrainians had their own militia that was committing Holocaust across the country of Ukraine. If Crimea was not populated by Russians but by the Ukrainians, probably 12,000 Jews would have been wiped out very quickly. Thankfully, because there were Russians living in Crimea, the Crimean Jews had enough time to move to Kazakhstan before German Nazis rolled in and occupied Crimea. And then later, as the Red Army expelled the German Nazis, all those 12,000 returned from Kazakhstan to Crimea, and that's how all the Crimean Jewish community was spared and survived. That probably would not have happened had Crimea been populated by the ethnic Ukrainians. So, just want to remind you of history so that you would know. I wish if Israel, State of Israel, and I wish if all Jewish world has taken a neutral stance. Yes, I feel sorry for Ukrainian people, and so should you. Yes, I understand there are many Jews in the Ukraine. Yes, I understand many Jews in Russia, therefore neutrality would have been the best stance. Yet, I'm very, very sad to see that you're supporting a country that has had neo-Nazi revival. At the same time, you're being completely anti-Russian, at least in your media. I'm very sorry about that. My Jewish compatriots, I'm very sorry about that because I don't think it's fair. The fair thing that you should have taken is to be at least neutral, if not even pro-Russian. Because Russians were the ones who liberated some Nazi camps and those Jewish inmates who survived. So that's much I wanted to say to you, dear friends, about the update from Ukraine. If there be any other relevant information that your Western media is not going to report to you, I'll certainly take the liberty to give you those reports and send you the updates from this part of the world. I wish to thank my friend from Canada who actually asked me to be sending him updates because he wanted to be informed from all sides. And that gave me the idea to actually make these audio recordings and inform not only him, but all of you who might be interested in all of this. Wishing you, to those of you who are entering the Sabbath very soon, wishing you a very happy Sabbath. And until I have to say something else, I'll be certainly giving you the updates. Those of you who have been listening to my messages on the channel, the Bible explanations, the explanation of the Bible doctrines, I wish to thank you. I'm very inspired by some of your messages that have come my way. And we have to endure to the end. The end is round the corner. The Messiah is closer than ever. His return, thankfully, is soon to put a stop to all of this madness, worldwide madness. But however, always keep in mind Matthew 24, verse 13, as the lawlessness increase, the love of many, or even most, will grow cold. However, Jesus Christ adds to that, but those who endure to the end, those shall be saved.